first agenda item. Mr. Samario.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. Two items to discuss today. First is how we fund a recent jury award to Mr. Barajas. And the second is what we do every year. We bring to the Finance Committee and Council our annual investment policy that reflects any changes that may have occurred to state law or just any technical changes we may want to make. We'll start with item one, of course. I'm sure you're aware of it, but just kind of by way of background, recently there was a jury verdict that awarded Mr. Barajas and others a total of $636,000 related to an inverse condemnation case. The actual damages awarded were $311. Attorney fees and costs were $325. As you know, we have a self-insurance fund, but we do not cover these types of tort claims. So we have no money that we have set aside to cover this. We've identified as staff some funding options we want to go over with you and with our own recommendation. But our goal today is to have Finance Committee either support their recommendation or come up with another recommendation that we would forward to Council, and that'll be on the 16th of this month for their approval. And with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Mr. Wiley. He's going to give you some background on the actual the case, kind of what led to this award.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I know you have a lot of the background of this case, so I'm going to move through it pretty quickly. But in terms of the Finance Committee, I think from staff's perspective, this is a bit of an unusual case, unusual litigation. You know, typically when the city has tort liability, it is something like a trip and fall case. That's by and large our largest source of liability exposure. But inverse condemnation is a real thing for cities, and we've been fortunate that we really haven't, that I can recall, faced an inverse condemnation, a successful inverse condemnation lawsuit in years and years. And then in this particular context, the law in California is fairly clear that when a city accepts a public street or maybe even builds a public street and dedicates it, the people with vehicular access using that street are pretty much then thereafter entitled to continue that access. Now, it's not absolute. For example, there's court decisions that say a city has the right to make it a one-way street, take it from two ways to one way, and that's not an inverse condemnation that you then have to drive around the block in order to get to your property. And there's also a case where a bus lane, an exclusive bus lane, and was dedicated, or parkway strips were added, and while it makes it more difficult perhaps to get access to your property, you still can do it. What we have here is a situation with the Conejo Road area with a very serious landslide called the Slide Mass C, and in particular at the end of Eland Place, the cul-de-sac there that's in the crosshatch has just been failing to stay where it's supposed to be for at least the last 30 years, but in particular the last few years. You know, one of the things the city has done since the mid-1980s is have monitoring stations in Slide Mass C, in particular in Eland Place. And we've moved from sort of a manual monitoring of these elevation points through surveyors actually going on site, through GPS monitoring, and the movement has been tremendously accelerated. And at least to my untrained ear, it's in 1 year I think we had 5 feet of movement in Eland Place, which brought us to a situation that we could see that we might have some responsibility to some of these homeowners or property owners adjacent to Eland Place. And we realized, well, we've got this cost-benefit analysis that we have to make under the law. And by that I mean a public cost versus public benefit. And, you know, Bob, if you want to just move through, they don't come across too well anyway because they're two-dimensional photos, but the extent of the failure of this portion of Eland Place is pretty incredible. So you can just, and to a point where I think we'll dwell on this slide a little bit. it would have been a tremendous expense just to bring this cul-de-sac portion of Eland Place back up to the city street standards. We had ballpark numbers, and they were really nothing more than that, of between 600,000 and 800,000. I think Mr. Kelly's probably more familiar, just to try to repair the road, where the geologists are telling us this is clearly just a temporary Band-Aid, if you will, solution. And it might last for 5 years, it might last for 10 years, but it could fail in 1 year, and it would all depend on the amount of rainfall. And so that was the Band-Aid solution. The permanent type of solution, which we talk about, in fact, I think Public Works staff in June of 2012, when the City Council decided to abandon this portion of Eland Place, said it would cost us between $3 and $4 million to do a permanent repair to Eland Place, to bring the cul-de-sac portion of Eland Place up to city street standards. But as I see it, that was really never a choice. That was really never realistic, because I believe the focus there was on the street itself. And in order to do a permanent repair, we would have had to repair a whole lot more than the street. We would have had to try to stop this slide altogether. And it's, of course, the slide is much bigger than just the cul-de-sac. Just I think a relevant example is across the Sycamore Canyon, outside of the city, as part of a settlement with Caltrans, the homeowners in the Sycamore Vista area spent somewhere between $50 and $60 million in what they believe to be a permanent repair of that slide. I believe their experts believe it to be a permanent repair, but it really remains to be seen how permanent it is. So when you think of the scale of what a permanent repair would have been, I don't even really think that was an option.
You have a question, Mr. White?
Thank you. There were two big repairs, as I recall, on that east side of Sycamore Canyon, and I'm wondering which one, the 50 to 60 million, is that what Caltrans spent on that big repair? Is that what you're referring to?
That's what I'm referring to, and
Okay.
I'm actually referring to a settlement. The homeowners settled with Caltrans, and a very long. I've seen the settlement agreement, and I don't remember the exact numbers because there were different parts of the settlement. Some of the money went directly to the homeowners in the area for their damages, and then the bulk of the money, and if I understand correctly, it's between 50 and 60 million, went to repairing that hillside, terracing it, putting in soil nails, and tying it all back into. So that slide has always been a much larger slide than slide Mass C, but I think that gives us an idea of the potential cost of a permanent fix to this problem. So really, what we were looking at was a Band-Aid solution, very expensive Band-Aid solution that could fail at any point in time, versus our obligations to the adjacent property owners. And in both cases, public taxpayer money, how is that well spent versus knowing that you're going to owe these property owners some money. But when we looked at this, and I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the red parcels, yeah, there you go. That one at the bottom corner, that's owned by one of the plaintiffs in this case. And she purchased it in 1972 for $5,000, and she's never built on it. And, who knows if she ever will build on it. So we're looking at why would we have a tremendously expensive repair for providing vehicular access to a parcel that has never been built on and may never be built on. Now that's not true of our other plaintiff, the Barajas, Mr. and Mrs. Barajas. That top left one there, that's a parcel that they own that had a home on it that burned in the T fire, and so it's now vacant, but it's right in the heart of slide Mass C. And in fact, the home that burned down in the T fire was on caissons, and you can see that those caissons failed. They didn't fail as a result of the fire. They failed as a result of the slide mass. But the Barajas decided to move across the street to the yellow parcel there, and that is an existing home, didn't burn in the T fire. Now, so this cost-benefit analysis was the cost of making it a public repairing it to public street standards versus abandoning it and letting it revert to the ownership of the adjacent property owners, to the Barajas and to Mrs. Lucadello. And that's what we decided to do, knowing that we were going to be looking at some inverse condemnation award for that. And that, those are the numbers, the jury verdict and the attorney fees and court costs that you have in your staff report. I know in discussing this over the months, I think at the council level as well as at the staff level, the question is, this is a very unusual lawsuit for us. We don't get many of these, and it's very integrally related with the streets maintenance fund, and yet it's liability. And so you could say, well, it's related to the city's liability reserves. And I don't want to speak for finance or the city administrator's office. It raises a question, particularly since it's kind of a one-of-a-kind situation. How do we pay for this judgment? So that's the extent of my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley.
So we've identified 4 options, although we feel various degrees of strength on each of these. We'll go through each one of these here. The Streets Fund, we believe that, as Mr. Wiley indicated, the Streets Fund is where you might want to look at potentially as a funding source. They are benefiting from the abandonment of Eileen's Place because they are no longer having to incur the cost to maintain that. So they're really enjoying the benefits of those savings, and that was part of the cost-benefit analysis that was completed. Unfortunately, the Streets Fund currently has virtually no amount of money in reserves. They've been using a fair amount of reserves over the last couple of years intentionally to build up their payment management program. So they are down to almost zero. We asked them the question, if we were to have you fund this, how would you go about doing so? And it would require basically a reduction on the flip side of that same program, reducing the payment management program to fund this $636,000 cost. One of the options that we wanted to go, use the Streets Fund as a source is to have either the general fund or the self-insurance fund, which has some reserves, has some cash, to advance the Streets Fund, essentially lend them the money and have them repay that over time. We could, and as Mr. Wiley indicated, it's one of those sort of nebulous claims. I will say that our self-insurance fund, while it does manage the general liability claims and losses, it doesn't include inverse condemnation. So we're not charging premiums to all departments and funds for anything related to inverse condemnation. It's the typical trips and falls types of cases, as well as property losses and workers' comp claims and losses. The self-insurance fund does have approximately $6 million in cash right now, but it's been accumulated to fund a corresponding amount of liabilities that it has for primarily 2 areas, general liability and workers' comp claims. So those assets, if you will, are already sort of spoken for. In fact, we have recorded liabilities for those. And so above all that, they do have some reserves that are essentially above what the actuaries tell us we need to have, about $400,000. I mentioned this to Mr. Armstrong because this is important. We are now closing our books as of June 30, 2013, and one of the things we're going to have to do is take a report that was recently completed by our actuaries, which indicate that our liabilities for workers' comp need to go up. We need to book more. So we will likely be having to increase those by $1 million to $2 million, which will kind of put us upside down. We're not going to be in trouble because we have plenty of cash there, but we're not going to have this like we had a few years ago, millions of dollars above what our actuaries told us we needed to have. So the money's there. We're not going to ever, go into negative on a cash basis, but we certainly have more than that in terms of claims against those assets. I mentioned just the fact that we have the general fund reserves. That money is available. We wouldn't recommend using general fund reserves, nor would we recommend using the one-time monies that we'll be talking about later that we've identified that would be going to capital, but that is potentially a source of revenues or a source of funds for that. So our recommendation is to have the self-insurance fund advance the money to the Streets Fund. So we would lend the Streets Fund $636,000 to cover the cost of the award, and then we would have the Streets Fund repay that loan over a period of years through a reduction of the repayment management program or through other means, and we would have them repay that over a period, for example, of 10 years, so that we're not hitting them so hard, but they can essentially pay us back at $60-some thousand per year, or at least the self-insurance fund. That's our recommendation, but be interested to get the feedback of the committee.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Samario. All right, questions and comments from my committee? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Samario, do I understand that the workers' comp claims are in decline? Did I hear that in our discussion?
Yes, Committee Member Murillo, the number of claims that we have are falling, but the magnitude of them has been rising. In fact, we've had a couple of bad years. When the actuaries look at to determine how much money we should have in the bank for these claims that are outstanding or even future claims that haven't been reported yet, they look at a 5-year history. And we had 2 bad years in workers' comp, or is that in workers' comp area. And so they, based on that, they say to us, hey, we need to raise how much we have set aside, because they look historically and statistically as to what we should be setting aside.
And the number they're recommending is $1 to $2 million every year, or just put that much into the savings, so to
Yeah,
speak?
the latter is putting that much more money into our bank account, if you will. Mark, did you want to add something to that? Okay.
Okay, no, that was all I had. So you're saying that if we took it out of this $6 million, we're pretty safe?
Sure.
Especially if Streets Fund pays it back, like $60,000 a year for 10 years?
Yeah, I think we're going to be okay, because we're never going to spend that money all at once. It's money that's spent over time, over at least 5 years. So I don't think we're ever going to be in a situation where we're going to be seeing those assets go down substantially.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may, while my mic is on, I just want to say to the residents up there what a unfortunate situation. And I know people buy property and they get attached and it's their home, and it's just unfortunate. And, I feel for them, and I'm sorry it all turned out this way. And I think the city's doing its best. So I'm curious to hear what you all have to say and make a motion. But I like the recommendation that you're making.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. White?
There's not much to like about this situation on all fronts, I don't think. I mean, it's just not a good one. And of course, I bemoan any reduction in the pavement program, which is already not fully funding a adequate maintenance of our system. So that part of it, I'd want to be. I want it to be re-examined as the years go by, or even the next year goes by. It's one of those areas where I feel very badly that the city is not at least holding our own on maintaining the streets. So that's whether we augment that with surpluses from when we do have our discussions next year about any leftover money. That's one place where I think we ought to be considering that. So I'll go along with this. I don't feel good about any option in this situation. If this is the least bad, then I'm okay with that. I do want us to look hard at trying to keep that pavement program as I won't call it robust, but at least as close to holding our own as possible.
Okay.
If I could add, I think if we spread this cost over 10 years, I think the public works folks, the streets folks will have some ability to better manage how they manage their projects, and maybe it could result in not a reduction in the pavement management program, but reduction in other projects, or even through savings in projects that they budgeted. So it's possible they may generate a year-end surplus, that could cover a lot of this. So I think the fact that we're spreading it out is going to give them some flexibility and maybe not have to go into reducing the pavement management program. But that is their primary sort of mission.
So, Mr. Samario, when I look at this, I think, I look at the core functions of the city, and they're basically public safety and public health and transportation. So the Streets Fund obviously is one of the city's core functions, and this is an unusual, as Mr. Wiley told us, an unusual occurrence. And I'm wondering about the one-time money. Since this is sort of a one-time event, maybe we should be looking at one-time money as a way of funding this rather than taking out of a core function. Could you talk a little bit about what the one-time money is?
Sure. Mr. Chair, so the one-time money we've talked about already is what was generated in the general fund. It's from the Flores case, from the reimbursement from the county of overcharges and property tax administration fees. We had a sale of some property along Milpas, and then some money that we got from as part of the city's allocation of the RDA's funds that it reserves that it got a share of. I think it's about a $4 million number. And those are funds that are one-time in nature, and they are unrestricted, and they are in the part of the general fund. Those are certainly an option for the committee and the council to use. But our recommendation is that it come out of the streets fund ultimately, because that's who's really enjoying the benefits of this decision and the savings of this decision. But that's up for discussion.
And when I think about that, I mean, there's no question that the streets fund will benefit from not having to maintain Eland Place. On the other hand, the streets fund has been underfunded. We have not kept the pavement maintenance level at the level that is ideal in terms of the long run. So it seems to me I would be in favor of considering the use of one-time money. Now, I know that takes away from other things. That takes away from capital programs and other things that we would like to fund.
Right.
I just have a serious concern about the condition of the streets.
Okay.
So I would, given that, I would entertain a motion from one of my fellow committee members on how to resolve this.
May I say that the one-time monies that we have, could those be spent on pedestrian safety improvement projects on the east side? That's really important to me, and that was the argument I was going to make if we could use the money to do that.
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Murillo, I think the monies could be spent on whatever is the liking of the council. I think as staff will likely bring to you a list of some of the priorities, or at least some options for to how to use those monies. They're capital, of course, capital projects, but it's ultimately up to the council how they want to spend those monies.
Well, with all due respect to the chair's opinion, I'd like to move that we recommend the staff recommendation for how to pay off this debt that we have.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second.
Discuss it momentarily.
Okay.
Thank you. And that is that I share Chair Francisco's concern, obviously, and my comments were in that same light. And I'm hearing Mr. Samario mention that there are possibilities that there are surpluses in other pieces of the streets fund or in other areas, other public works areas. What areas would those?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Mr. White, the surpluses I was referring to are strictly within the streets fund. So they have a number of projects. The pavement management is a lot of what they do, but they have other projects that are streets related. And I'm just thinking, theoretically that any given year they could have some projects that come in under budget and therefore fall to the reserves. So that's one option. But as you know, they are overall underfunded when it comes to the streets program. So the only suggestion is that, or at least comment, is that it may not have to necessarily come from the pavement management program. They could have another project that would come under budget. Normally if that happens, they would take those monies and put it toward pavement management. But we're not talking about a lot of money. I'm just suggesting that any given year you can have a small amount of surplus that can help cover part of the $60,000 per year debt obligation.
Okay.
And Mr. Kelly's here. I mean, if you can probably expand on that a little more. If you have, want more detail on that.
I picture myself not wanting to take the money out of the paving program. I think that's just, and I could see it even coming out of other sources. I mean, I appreciate the point you're making, and I'd like to have that be a constant conversation year in and year out to go, no, we don't want to touch that if we have any other options.
Mr. Kelly.
Chair and Finance Committee. The annual streets capital that we have is about a little over $2 million, and that consists of pavement maintenance and a certain amount of funding set aside for sidewalk repair, traffic signal maintenance, streetlight maintenance, and some access ramps. So it's a limited pot, so there's no really good place to take the money. Everything has a need. Much of the information, for example, on streetlights and traffic signals, those are called capital funds, but essentially they're for the upkeep and maintenance of the existing system. In a sense, each of those items I mentioned is like, the pavement maintenance is to upkeep the pavement, the sidewalk repair, essentially upkeep that. So,
Each one of those elements, if I may, Mr. Chair, is underfunded.
yes.
Right. Well, what I would ask is, what I would support this motion is that we also have this topic come up when we do have the one-time funding conversation, so that at least we're having this is in the mix for that discussion.
Mr. Armstrong, do you have something to say?
I was just kind of thinking as you were talking, possibly a hybrid option would be that part of it is we have a cash flow issue. We need to make the payment on the judgment, that we advance that money out of the insurance fund, and then you defer the decision, or you recommend the council defer the decision of how we reimburse the insurance fund until you have the discussion on the one-time monies, and we can have one of the options that we present to council. And this is probably going to be not until late in the calendar year, because we first have to have the discussion on the RDA bond monies, and then we can come back and we can have this either one of the options could be reimburse the insurance fund out of those one-time monies, or in the alternative then allocate it over a 10-year period to the streets fund. So you could authorize an advance payment now, and then we could worry about that when you have a chance to put it in the set of you're looking at what the other priorities are, and you're not just deciding with just looking at this issue.
Yeah. That would make me more comfortable, Mr. Chair, and I would ask the maker of the motion to at least have that be considered.
I care very much about your comfort, Mr. White. So I changed my motion to that we recommend paying the Barajas settlement. Verdict jury award out of the self-insurance fund, and then figure out later. It has to come back to the whole council anyway, right? Figure out later how to pay it back.
In the context of when you deal with the other one-time monies.
Right.
Okay.
What do you say?
Is the second
That
of the
sounds good.
motion
That sounds,
amenable to that?
Sounds better.
Very good. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Thank you. We have one more item,
Yes.
and our Treasury Manager, Jeannie Wilson, will be covering this item.
Ms. Wilson.
Chair and committee members. Once a year, you will see in the month of July or so an annual investment or statement of investment policy. This investment policy governs how the city invests its funds with the adequate guidelines. This Government Code 53600 establishes the permitted investments that cities must adhere to. It doesn't, however, require an annual investment policy, but as a best practice, the city believes it is recommended to come forward and make any changes annually, whether they're statutory or administrative. This year, the one change you will see in your investment policy is the removal of reference to redevelopment agencies, as state law did change last year, and that has gone away. So that was the only change made to the investment policy. All other parameters of the policy have remained the same. But essentially, the purpose of the investment policy is to establish those guidelines and also to prioritize the objectives for the city. Primary is the safeguard of the principal. secondary is to meet the liquidity needs of the city. And then thirdly is to achieve a rate of return. In addition, it also sets the standards of care within your policy and also delegates the authority for the investment policy. So not having many changes, there isn't much to cover, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Okay, very good. Any questions from committee members? No. Mr. White? I think we're satisfied with the policy as is.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And just so you know, this item is on the consent calendar for today at council.
Okay, great. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.